Japanese women, because they weren't supposed to use Chinese, were confined to more conversational Japanese.
Of course that's your contention. You're a first-year grad student. You just got finished reading some Marxian historian, Pete Garrison probably.
And they end up doing a lot of the innovation in literature.
That's going to last until next year. You're going to be in here regurgitating Gordon Wood, talking about, you know, the pre-revolutionary utopia and the capital-forming effects of military mobilization.
It was because they were excluded in a way that it actually gave them access to something else that they ended up making just as interesting or more powerful in a way.
Yeah, I read that too. Were you going to plagiarize the whole thing for us? Do you have any thoughts of your own on this matter?
I've said in a previous video that Anita's statements about her ordinary, extraordinary women of the past don't make sense. Let's briefly look at each of them in the order in which she introduces them.
Jing Shi started out working in a brothel and ended up as the feared commander of one of the largest pirate fleets in history.
Okay, so we have a female pirate, a fearsome female pirate in Anita's words.
Although you may not have heard of them, the past was full of women who were rebels. Anarchists, undercover reporters, technological geniuses, and even fearsome pirates.
Now, I obviously can't read Chinese, let alone Chinese from over 150 years ago, so my knowledge of Jing Shi is rather slim. It seems like Jing Shi really is an exception to the rule that fearsome pirates are pretty much always men, but she's not as much of an exception as Anita might think, if what I do know is correct. Jing Shi was a prostitute who got kidnapped by pirates. She married a pirate king who then died, and then she assumed the position of authority. She then delegated her responsibilities of leading the army to a man who had also been kidnapped into the same fleet at the age of 15, but nonetheless had become such a good pirate that he was second in command to her dead husband, and was the perfect person to gain the loyalty of the common pirates. Again, most information about Jing Shi is either in Chinese or it's in books in English that are mostly out of print. The two most cited books on Jing Shi's Wikipedia page are out of print on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Half.com, and even eBay. Oh well, however, let's take a few things into account. It seems Jing Shi really did exhibit some superior intelligence in being able to gain command of her pirate fleet, even though she was a woman. I'll give her props for that. Obviously, she needed to be on good terms with all of her pirate leaders in order to ensure that they would want to follow her and do what she said. But let's be frank here, she's not that amazing. This super amazing, fearsome, defiant woman of history that Anita proclaims her to be was, on her own, a whore. A woman who made her living by being paid to have sex. She wasn't some stalwart woman who decided to become a pirate on her own. Left to her own devices, she was a hooker, nothing more. She happened to be kidnapped by pirates, and then, obviously, to learn to live like a pirate, and then married a pirate king after having been kidnapped. That's how she became what she was, gaining enough favor amongst a horde of bloodthirsty pirates to allow a woman to be their leader is noteworthy. But it had nothing to do with defiance. You get in the face of bloodthirsty murderers, you wind up dead. Jing Shi gained their favor, but is anyone seriously going to argue that they said something like, "No, you're not going to be our pirate king, 'cause you're a woman"? No, I am gonna be your pirate king. And then those same bloodthirsty murderers were like, "Oh, well, alright then." No! If they didn't want her to be their king, any one of those pirate men close to her could have killed her if they wanted to. Now again, how did Jing Shi manage to make them want to keep her alive instead, and not just keep her alive, but for her to be at the top of the food chain? That's the intrigue of Jing Shi. She seems to have pulled off an amazing trick in this regard. I'd love to have it explained to me. But surely plenty of male pirates before her had learned whatever she had come to learn. That fleet with its captains and leaders existed before she came along. She seems to have learned well from them, but they learned it first. On a final note, Anita said later in her campaign video that these ordinary, extraordinary women suffered from harassment and death threats.
But they spoke up for themselves, often at the cost of harassment, slander, racism, and even death threats.
Is it really so insane to say that I'm kind of okay with that, since Jing Shi was a freaking pirate? You know, thieving, murdering people who sailed the seven seas? Of course they got death threats, no duh. Anita mentions harassment as if pirates gave a crap what other people thought of them. They were freaking pirates. It was kind of their thing, but it had nothing to do with gender. It had to do with pirates being evil people who killed and plundered innocent people. Should we now see Xingxi in a sympathetic light for, quote, daring to defy history, unquote, even though she is a documented murderer? I really have nothing left to say about Xingxi at this particular point in time. We'll just have to wait to see the full episode to see if Anita Sarkeesian will try to tackle the question of how it is that she was able to become the leader of her pirates.
Ida B. Wells was born a slave but became a daring investigative reporter who exposed the horrors of lynching after the Civil War.
True, I can't find a single problem with that. Ida B. Wells did write about the horrors of lynching after the Civil War. Here's what I'd like to point out. First, the Civil War ended when Ida was less than a year old. Yeah, she was born a slave, but wasn't exactly a woman who endured a lifetime of turmoil. As far as I can tell, this so-called defiant woman of history never had to fight against racist white people to get a job. She was never personally physically assaulted in her lifetime by white people, with the exception of her being forcibly removed from a train car reserved for white people only. The conductor did try to remove her by force, and when he did, she immediately bit him on the hand. In Ida's words, he tried to drag me out of the seat, but the moment he caught hold of my arm, I fastened my teeth in the back of his hand. Later on page 19 of Crusade for Justice, she also says, strangely, I held on to my ticket all this time, and although the sleeves of my linen duster had been torn out and I had been pretty roughly handled, I had not been hurt physically. So even in this one incident of what we today might call assault, she wasn't hurt physically. So how was she so defiant? According to her, it was because of her lawsuit against that railroad. In her words, it was the first case in which a colored plaintiff in the South had appealed to a state court since the repeal of the Civil Rights Bill by the United States Supreme Court. It seems as though it would be accurate to cast Ida B. Wells as a defiant woman of history, but again, she's not as amazing as Anita thinks. For one thing, Ida B. Wells herself said that the reason her case had attracted so much attention was not because she was a woman, but because she was black. This had purely to do with her race, not her gender. Also, this defiant black lady, in her attempts to win her lawsuit, only won with the assistance of white men after the initial betrayal of black men, or one particular black man to be accurate. She writes again in Crusade for Justice that, I went back to Memphis and engaged a colored lawyer to bring suit against the railroad for me. After months of delay, I found he had been bought off by the road. And as he was the only colored lawyer in town, I had to get a white one. So even in her fighting against racism, it wasn't defiance against a purely racist white society. It was against evil people in general, including black people. But there's more. Who ruled over the case and ruled in her favor? According to Ida B. Wells, it was Judge Pierce, an ex-Union soldier. Yeah, that's right, a white man, a former soldier who fought against the Confederacy. You know, the Confederacy that wanted to protect the practice of owning slaves. He presided over her case and ruled in her favor. Oh, but it gets better. Remember that white lawyer she had to hire because her black lawyer betrayed her? She refers to him as Judge Greer in Crusade for Justice. More specifically, according to a note at the bottom of page 56 of the Memphis Diary of Ida B. Wells, his full name was James M. Greer, also a former Union officer, just like the judge who ruled in her favor. So when I think of Ida B. Wells, describing her as defiant, it's really not the term I would use. She was a decent journalist who did help to expose how black men were unjustifiably being slaughtered by white mobs. She pointed people to the evidence, which is what any ethical journalist should do. Did she have to face the fears of being violently persecuted for what she'd done? Definitely. I can credit her with some measure of bravery and courage. Again, just not as much as Anita might have you to believe. And I still wouldn't credit her success as a journalist to being defiant. If a white mob decided to lynch her, they could have done so. If white people all around her were exclusively racist and never allowed her to be educated or to get a job, she couldn't have gotten as far as she did. She wouldn't have even won her first case. If it weren't for the hundreds of thousands of white soldiers who died to abolish slavery, she would have just remained a slave. And if it weren't for those two white guys who fought against racism in the Civil War, who went on to become Ida's lawyer and judge in the first case she ever filed, she never would have won and garnered so much attention to herself. Her success can't be credited to defiance so much as it can be credited towards the various people in her life who allowed her or aided her to achieve what she achieved. She was a decent journalist, moderately brave, and a little bit daring, and that's about it.
Murasaki Shikibu lived at a time when women's names were rarely even written down, but it didn't stop her from writing the first modern novel.
No argument here. As far as I can tell, Murasaki Shikibu is the one who wrote the first modern novel about 1,000 years ago. But hang on here, women's names were rarely written down? Who has read so much ancient Chinese and Japanese literature from around the 10th and 11th centuries who verified that particular little bit of info? Was it Laura Hudson? Was it Anita Sarkeesian? I don't think so. I'd love to see the source that justifies this claim and answers these questions. Or better yet, let's see if we can't nail down the source for this claim. Is it page 3 of Richard Bowring's book on Murasaki? I found the following here. Seldom were women known by their own names. They existed rather in the shadow of titles held by brothers or fathers. Is this the quote where Anita Sarkeesian or Laura Hudson got the idea that women's names were rarely written down? If so, I don't see that anywhere. Women were rarely known by their names, so what, that means they were hardly ever written down? Says who? Not this quote. The fuller context of this quote talks about women waiting to be visited, gazing out onto rainy gardens, etc. That says nothing one way or the other about names being written, much less does it say that women's names were rarely written down when men's were written down frequently. In fact, it seems like even if it is true that women's names weren't written down, the same could be said of men as far as Murasaki's own novel is concerned. If the tale of Genji is a representative example of what names were written down, then it means that names of men and women in general weren't written down. On page 71 of this same book, we read the following. The matter of titles is connected with the other vexing matter of the names of the characters. It seems incredible, but nonetheless true, that almost no one of any importance in the Genji has anything remotely approaching what we would consider to be a personal name. Characters are usually referred to by a title or a rank. Chuno Chujo, for instance, actually means head of the Imperial Secretariat and middle captain. The male ranks change constantly in the course of such a long work, and the women are referred to by various locutions, such as the woman of the West Wing, or the main wife, references which tend to change according to the immediate context. Clearly, none of these titles or phrases is adequate for identifying these people as characters throughout the whole work. So there you have it. According to this Richard Bowring, or Bowring, this lack of personal names is a truth for both male characters and female characters alike in the tale of Genji. Does this mean Murasaki is also one of those oppressive sexist bigots? Or rather, isn't this simply a cultural norm that had nothing to do with oppressing women? On a final note, there's this little passing statement made in a discussion of other topics in the book that nonetheless is interesting to read. On page 17 it reads, in contrast to male writings in Sino-Japanese, with their interest in names, objects, dates, and the careful recording of ceremonial in the interests of documenting precedent, a work like the Kagero Diary does not bother to situate itself in a concrete historical context. There are few dates, few names, no references to political realities. And it goes on from there. This is why I'll ask the question, in what language were women's names rarely written down? Was it Sino-Japanese? This little quote seems to casually remark that Sino-Japanese writings written by men are noted for their interest in names, objects, dates, etc. Might that include women's names as well as men's? I don't know. What's even more interesting and what makes this question more relevant is that it seems that learning to read and write Japanese was perfectly acceptable for women, and they're the ones who wrote the history we glean from today according to this book. After giving an excerpt from Murasaki on her hiding her learning of classical Chinese, Bowring writes, in such an environment, it is only natural that women had recourse to Japanese and began to make it their own, creating a medium for the expression of their special concerns. To a great extent, it is the women who are the source of our historical knowledge. They have become our historians, and it is they who define the parameters within which we are permitted to approach their world and their men. In retrospect, it is a form of sweet revenge. So even in acknowledging that there was scorn for women who would learn classical Chinese specifically, women were not made illiterate dummies. They were allowed to learn to read and write, and do so to such an extent that this author declares them to be the source of a great deal of our historical knowledge. So since women were responsible for writing Japanese history, doesn't that mean it's their fault for not writing their own names down? If their names weren't written down, isn't that their own fault? And how is this all possible in a world that was meant to silence women, according to Anita Sarkeesian?
In a world that was designed to silence and diminish them,
This horrid culture Anita wants to paint in order to emphasize how extraordinary Murasaki was keeps falling flat the more I read about her. If Murasaki was anything, defiant wasn't one of them. She found it wise to hide certain things she'd learned from certain people in certain contexts. If anything, her hiding her education was a perfect example of the opposite of defiance.
they had to be more than just talented. They had to be defiant.
No, she didn't. She got to write the first modern novel because the Empress herself told her to, not because Murasaki was some spunky little girl who got in people's faces and told them she'd do whatever she wanted. You see Murasaki tactfully concealing her knowledge. That's not defiantly speaking up for herself. Whatever you wish to call it, it isn't that. I realize some people might still be thinking, yeah, that sounds good, but you don't know that they got their information from this book. I'm pretty darn sure that they did. Let me quote Laura Hudson to you. It's almost like she's directly quoting from this book when she describes women in Japanese culture of Murasaki's times.
Japanese women, because they weren't supposed to use Chinese, were confined to more conversational Japanese. And they ended up doing a lot of the innovation in literature because they had the more conversational language to work with. And so that's part of what, Murasaki's work came out of, and a lot of women in her era and a bit later. Like a lot of that, the literary traditions of Japan come from women in that era. Because they were excluded in a way that it actually gave them access to something else that they ended up making just as interesting or more powerful in a way.
Yeah, I read that too. Were you going to plagiarize the whole thing for us? Do you have any thoughts of your own on this matter?
Where did Laura Hudson get this information? Is it just so coincidental that her description of Murasaki's culture happened to basically repeat exactly what Richard Bowring said? I don't think so. And she still got something wrong here. She said Murasaki was told that Chinese was not a language for women.
She was told that women didn't learn Chinese because that was the language of power and of politics and, not the language of women.
That's false by simplicity. Learning Chinese was looked down upon in general. The very page of this book, page 11, wherein Murasaki's father wishes his daughter were a man, Murasaki herself writes that, I gradually realized that people were saying it's bad enough when a man flaunts his Chinese learning. She will come to no good. At best, it seems it was more looked down upon for a woman to learn specifically how to write classical Chinese. That's it. Laura says Chinese was the language of power and politics and not the language of women. Sorry, Laura, but this quote from Murasaki herself tells us it wasn't supposed to be the language of Japanese people in general, not women specifically. The quote said, it's bad enough when a man flaunts his Chinese learning? That seems to indicate that it was looked down upon for men or women, not just women specifically. I sure do hope there are responses to all of these little facts in Anita's full episode about Murasaki, but if we're honest, there's no reason to expect that Anita will interact with even half of the points I brought up here.
Emma Goldman's radical ideas about gender and individual freedom got her kicked out of at least 3 countries and labeled one of the most dangerous women in America.
Oh yeah, Emma Goldman, an atheistic anarchist feminist who it seems was deported from multiple countries in her lifetime. It seems this is the single woman in this series that could accurately be described as defiant. She defied the law on multiple occasions and was labeled one of the most dangerous women in America. It seems that Anita is on the right track as far as Emma Goldman is concerned. However, I would definitely like to hear what Anita would think about the views Emma Goldman espoused. After all, Anita said it was Emma Goldman's radical ideas about gender and individual freedom that got her deported, so let's see if Anita would like to stand behind them. Would Anita like to agree with Emma Goldman's view that the female gender wouldn't be helped at all by having the right to vote? Emma Goldman writes on page 173 of Anarchism and Other Essays. Yet all these disastrous results of the 20th century fetish have taught woman nothing. But then, woman will purify politics, we are assured. Few countries have produced such arrogance and snobbishness as America. Particularly, this is true of the American woman of the middle class. She not only considers herself the equal of man, but his superior, especially in her purity, goodness, and morality. Small wonder that the American suffragist claims for her vote the most miraculous powers. In her exalted conceit, she does not see how truly enslaved she is. Not so much by man, as by her own silly notions and traditions. Suffrage cannot ameliorate that sad fact, it can only accentuate it, as indeed it does. There is no reason whatever to assume that woman in her climb to emancipation has been or will be helped by the ballot. So women are delusional in thinking the right to vote did them any good. Does Anita agree with that? Is that one of those radical ideas that Anita finds praiseworthy? Or how about something else? How about Emma Goldman's scathing views of childbearing? In her essay titled The Social Aspects of Birth Control, Emma Goldman declared that the centuries past where men and women had as many children as they could were blindly and stupidly dedicating its offspring to Moloch. She writes, "Those who oppose the birth control movement claim to do so in behalf of motherhood. All the political charlatans prate about this wonderful motherhood, yet on closer examination we find that this motherhood has gone on for centuries past, blindly and stupidly dedicating its offspring to Moloch." Moloch, or Molech in case you didn't know, was a pagan Canaanite deity to whom the Canaanites sacrificed their children. Yeah, that was Emma Goldman, this defiant woman of history, comparing the opposition to birth control to murdering children in sacrifice to a false god. But that's not even the first insane thing she said. Previously, she said, "Secondly, there is the mental awakening of woman that plays no small part in behalf of birth control. For ages she has carried her burdens, has done her duty 1,000-fold more than the soldier on the battlefield. After all, the soldier's business is to take life. For that he is paid by the state, eulogized by political charlatans, and upheld by public hysteria. But woman's function is to give life. Yet neither the state, nor politicians, nor public opinion have ever made the slightest provision in return for the life woman has given." Would Anita Sarkeesian stand behind Emma Goldman's words that the soldier on the battlefield is 1,000 times less important than a mother? I mean, we could go on and dissect this in great detail, but most notably in this same essay, Emma Goldman contradicts herself. She just said women give life, yet neither the state nor politicians and so on and so forth have ever made the slightest provision in return for the life women have given. Then later she turns around and says, "Nothing so binds the workers to the block as a brood of children, and that is exactly what the opponents of birth control want. Wretched as the earnings of a man with a large family are, he cannot risk even that little, so he continues in the rut, compromises and cringes before his master, just to earn barely enough to feed the many little mouths. He dare not join a revolutionary organization. He dare not go on strike. He dare not express an opinion." So in spite of the fact that Emma Goldman recognized that children are the great motivator that drives fathers to work themselves so hard and long, even in horrid workplace conditions, so that they can give the little bits of money they can earn to feed their children, she nonetheless maintained that mothers themselves received not even the slightest provision in return for the lives she bore. What? How does that work? He's feeding her children, and obviously her as well, and he will endure whatever it takes to make sure they don't starve to death. But no, apparently there's not a single provision given to the mother in return for bearing the children. This is the kind of irrational thinking that pervades feminist writings in general. It's contradictory through and through. So how on earth did Emma Goldman make this list? Anita said it was her radical views that got her deported, so does that mean Anita stands behind them? Maybe she made this list because Anita doesn't care what she believed. She was radical and got deported, so that makes her extraordinary. I don't know. Again, we'll have to wait and see.
And Ada Lovelace's doctor said her feminine mind was too weak and fragile to handle advanced math. She ignored him and wrote the world's first computer program.
Wait just a minute. Ada Lovelace's doctor told her her feminine mind was too weak to handle advanced math? Are you really sure about that? I can't find a single quote anywhere about any doctor that ever told her that. In trying to nail down the source for this claim, I think I found it here in the book Ada's Algorithm, How Lord Byron's Daughter Ada Lovelace Launched the Digital Age. It speaks about one of her tutors, Augustus de Morgan. It quotes a letter from him that reads, "All women who have published mathematics hitherto have shown knowledge and the power of getting it, but no one has wrestled with difficulties and shown a man's strength in getting over them. The reason is obvious. The very great tension of mind which they require is beyond the strength of a woman's physical power of application." Ooh, how horrid and misogynistic of him that he would dare to suggest that understanding mathematics is outside the physical capabilities of women. But in the very next sentence, he speaks about Ada Lovelace herself and says, "Lady L has unquestionably as much power as would require all the strength of a man's constitution to bear the fatigue of thought, to which it will unquestionably lead her." So even though this tutor of Ada Lovelace declared that women lack the brain power to handle mathematics as well as a man, man, he immediately followed up with saying that Ada Lovelace herself had the very kind of manly brain power and strength necessary to handle mathematics. He didn't say her feminine mind was too weak and fragile. He said the polar opposite of that. But Anita says Ada ignored him. Ignored what? We don't even know if Ada even knew this letter existed. This same letter begs Ada's parents to keep the letter confidential. And what would she be ignoring when she heard that her tutor found her just as capable of understanding mathematics as a man? Seems to me like she'd take that as a compliment. So who was it that said that? What doctor or tutor of Ada Lovelace's told her that her feminine mind was too weak and fragile to handle advanced math? I want to know, because if this is the man they're referring to, then that's just not true. Not to mention, this man tutored Ada Lovelace for free, and she was encouraged in her pursuit of the study of math by her own mother. Whom did she have to defy in order to become the world's first computer programmer? The very tutor of hers that saw women as being incapable of handling math the way men can didn't refuse to tutor her. He did, and did so without being paid. Even a so-called misogynist like him didn't stand in her way. But Anita would have you to believe that Ada had to be defiant and speak up for herself at the cost of harassment and death threats. I don't see that anywhere. As to whether Ada wrote the world's first computer program, there is no doubt that Ada Lovelace is considered to be the world's first computer programmer. However, it's far from settled that she actually wrote the first program like Anita says. I'd actually argue that it's impossible for Ada to have written the first computer program, but the material to make that argument thoroughly is titanic. Rather than go through all that, let's look at a couple detractors and even what a proponent of this belief have to say. Two people writing in Scientific America in 1999 definitively declared, many people, for instance, incorrectly claim that Ada was the first computer programmer. Babbage, not Ada, wrote the first programs for his analytical engine, although most were never published. That's not all. Even in a recent book that declares Ada Lovelace to be the first computer programmer, they make this specific qualification of what that means. Although there were earlier sketches for programs that had been prepared by Babbage, Lovelace's were the most elaborate and complete, and they were the first to be published. It is for this achievement that Lovelace is known as the first computer programmer. She was the first person to write and publish a full set of instructions that a computing device could use to reach an end result that had not been calculated in advance. So even some of the people who declare that Ada Lovelace was the first programmer recognize that it's not because she actually wrote the first computer program. It's because she managed to publish her more elaborate and complete programs first. That's it. This issue is unfortunately made even more confusing when Laura Hudson says that the controversy surrounding whether Ada wrote the first program is akin to debating whether she wrote a computer program or a modern computer program.
It's a controversial notion whether or not she created the first computer program, which is something that I discovered. Some of that is semantic, where it's like, is it the first, similarly, with Murasaki, she created the first modern novel, right? It depends on how you define that. And the question is did she create the first computer program, the first modern computer program? How do we define that?
No, it's not. It's whether she did or she didn't write her program first. At best, it's a debate about who published theirs first. And even then, the proponents of that position are careful to clarify that while she did get hers published before Charles Babbage published his, she still wasn't the first person to write the first program. Laura Hudson went on to describe how a lot of people inappropriately tried to undermine Ada Lovelace's work, which I think is true. I think a couple people out there do criticize Ada Lovelace unfairly. They're wrong in saying she was dumb or only contributed trouble to Charles Babbage's work. She talks about this for a while, but then finished by saying that because of this kind of treatment of Lovelace's work, that's why she decided to definitively declare that Ada was the world's first programmer. Not because she got her program published first, not because she wrote hers down first, since clearly that's not true. She didn't even get into the debate she says is going on about whether Ada wrote a modern computer program. None of that at all. She says she decided to call Ada the first computer programmer because feminist frequency wants to draw parallels between the struggles of women back then to the struggles of women today, that they declared her the first programmer. I am not kidding.
And it infuriated me. It infuriated me because in so many of these, we're trying to make a connection to the past. We're trying to take the struggles of these women from the past and find some way to make them relate to the lives of contemporary women, to make that connection. And for most of them, I felt like there were thematic ways to do that. But the Ada Lovelace script, the problem that we were talking about wasn't even happening in the past. It was happening now. the same undermining that she was experiencing then, it never stopped. It continued. It's still happening. So that was the most interesting one to me, because I felt like when we were writing that, we chose deliberately to make that statement. She was the first computer programmer, and to some degree, that's the only script that I feel like is speaking directly to certain people. I feel like, from my perspective, it's addressing those critics.
At least the Passion for Science book had the decency to say that they call Ada Lovelace the world's first computer programmer in spite of her not having written the first program. At least those people are upfront and clear about their reasons for doing so, but Laura Hudson says she did it to get back at people who criticize Ada Lovelace.
When we were writing that, we chose deliberately to make that statement. She was the first computer programmer. That's the only script that I feel like is speaking directly to certain people. From my perspective, it's addressing those critics.
There you can see what really is driving this series. It's to get back at mean critics who dare to suggest, as I have suggested during this whole video, that women just aren't as extraordinary as Anita Sarkeesian or Laura Hudson want them to be. And how extraordinary is Ada Lovelace really? She pales by comparison when you realize that Charles Babbage, the very man who invented the computer for which she wrote her program, was the man who had to invent the very machine that had the capability to be programmed by her in the first place, and he did so without ever building it. What incredible genius did he need to even invent such a thing purely on paper? Oh, and it wasn't his first invention either. He had invented and partially built a device called a difference engine that more or less is a large primitive calculator. He managed to build 1/7 of this engine, which required 2,000 parts, and according to computerhistory.org, works impeccably to this day. And this was done in 1832, which, by the way, was before the year in which he even met Ada Lovelace. Isn't that level of genius far more amazing than Ada Lovelace's? To be sure, Charles Babbage held her intellect in great esteem. It seems Ada Lovelace was truly an ingenious woman of her time, but she pales in comparison to a much greater man. Her legacy is built upon his work. She never invented anything. He did. So what do we make of this truly extraordinary woman of history? Was she smart and intelligent and amazingly insightful? Yes, she certainly was. However, it was Charles Babbage who had to invent the prerequisite machines so that she could understand them and then write programs for them. She was not defiant. She had no need to quote-unquote speak up for herself, and did not endure targeted hatred for her learning advanced math. Ada Lovelace would be so much more easy to appreciate were it not for the lies about her writing the world's first computer program, and the lies about her having to achieve what she achieved by fighting valiantly against a so-called horribly misogynistic society. But never mind about all that. Anita Sarkeesian series is a celebration of Women's History Month, and we're going to talk about ordinary, extraordinary women being defiant, even though Charles Babbage was so much more smart than Ada Lovelace, because Women's History Month is just what it sounds like. It's not about truth, brilliance, or bravery first and foremost. Those qualities are secondary. It's first about glorifying women, even if it comes at the expense of overlooking far greater examples of intelligence that can be found if you look at men and women in general, because for some reason, it's more important that we reimagine a world where women doing incredible revolutionary things is normal.
Although each of them is extraordinary, they can help us reimagine the world as a place where women doing revolutionary things isn't incredible at all. It's just normal.
And of course, in those last few sentences, I just exposed how retarded this series is before the first episode has even aired. The concern is not for truth. The concern is to make women look good at the expense of the truth. And do you think any of Anita Sarkeesian's videos will come even close to offering the level of information that I just gave you about these women? But I didn't ask for $200,000. Not that I don't want $200,000, but I didn't need $200,000 to get this information. But you know what? Let me tell you an embarrassing little secret about all this. Anyone with a decent internet connection can get a hold of all the info I found without paying a single penny. Anita Sarkeesian got $200,000 to create episodes full of information that you can get for absolutely free. That's the dirty little secret that seemingly none of the people who donated literally hundreds of thousands of dollars know about. They paid $200,000 for information anyone can get for free.
See, the sad thing about a guy like you is in 50 years, you're going to start doing some thinking on your own, and you're going to come up with the fact that there are two certainties in life. One, don't do that. And two, you dropped 150 grand on a education you could have got for $1.50 in late charges at the public library.
And that's what I have to say about Anita Sarkeesian's Ordinary Women. I really enjoyed making this video. It was a ton of work, and if you think it was worth your time, let me know by clicking the like button and the subscribe button in that order. It takes less than 5 seconds if you're already logged into your Google account and would be greatly appreciated considering the huge number of hours I spent making this. Thank you for watching. I am Prince Asbel, and I look forward to seeing you again on the Prince Asbel channel.